The film opens with a tense and foreboding atmosphere, immediately establishing Charles Ronay as a dangerous and calculating international terrorist. Ronay is introduced in a hospital setting, where he is about to undergo plastic surgery to alter his appearance and evade capture. The FBI is hot on his trail, and the scene is charged with suspense as the surgeons prepare to administer anesthesia. Just as the surgeon is about to put him under, Ronay, with chilling calmness, asks for the time. Before the surgeon can respond, Ronay springs into action, slitting the man's throat with a blade. As he quickly escapes through the hospital, evading the FBI agents who burst in moments too late. Ronay leaps through a window, landing on the ground below with surprising agility, and continues his desperate flight through the city streets. Despite the FBI's relentless pursuit, Ronay's cunning and physical prowess allow him to stay one step ahead, at least for a while. However, his luck eventually runs out, and he is captured and arrested. A few days after his arrest, Ronay is seen meeting with his lawyer in a stark prison room. The lawyer informs him that he is being transported to Los Angeles, where he will face trial and likely receive the death penalty for his international crimes. The lawyer suggests using Ronay's troubled childhood as a mitigating factor in his defense, but Ronay reacts with explosive anger, warning the lawyer never to speak of his past. This moment reveals a glimpse of Ronay's psychological complexity, his refusal to be seen as a victim or to allow his past to define him. Meanwhile, the scene shifts its focus to John Cutter, a former counterterrorism expert who is grappling with personal demons. Cutter is haunted by the memory of his wife's tragic murder during a convenience store robbery, a traumatic event that has left him emotionally scarred and hardened. Flashbacks reveal the pain and guilt he carries, as well as the sense of loss that has shaped his no-nonsense, tough-as-nails attitude. Despite his expertise and skills, Cutter is a man struggling to find purpose and redemption. Cutter is then introduced at an aviation security training seminar, where he demonstrates his exceptional abilities by disarming a mock hijacker with swift precision. His confidence and expertise impress the trainees, but it's clear that Cutter is going through the motions, his passion for the job tempered by his personal struggles. Shortly after the seminar, Cutter is approached by his old friend, Sly Del Vecchio, who offers him a position as the head of security for Atlantic International Airlines. Though initially reluctant, Cutter ultimately accepts the job, setting him on a path that will soon intersect with Charles Ronay's. A couple of days later, Cutter boards Flight 163 to Los Angeles, unaware that the same plane is also transporting Charles Ronay under heavy FBI guard. The atmosphere on the plane is calm and routine as passengers settle in for the flight. Flight attendants, including Marty and Sabrina, go about their duties, welcoming passengers and preparing for takeoff. However, unbeknownst to the authorities, Ronay's loyal henchmen are already on board, disguised as ordinary passengers and crew members. As the plane takes off, the tension begins to build. The flight attendants make their usual announcements, and passengers relax into their seats. One passenger, an elderly woman, is visibly nervous about flying and is seated next to John Cutter. She strikes up a conversation, but Cutter, preoccupied and introspective, eventually excuses himself and retreats to the restroom to clear his mind. Suddenly, the hijacking begins with shocking swiftness. Sabrina, one of Ronay's henchmen disguised as a flight attendant, retrieves a hidden gun and coldly executes the FBI agents guarding Ronay. She frees him from his restraints, and Ronay immediately takes control of the situation, shooting one of the pilots and announcing the hijacking over the intercom. The passengers are thrown into a state of panic as Ronay asserts his dominance, warning them not to resist and emphasizing that their weapons are real. Cutter, still in the restroom, hears the commotion and cautiously peeks out to assess the situation. Realizing the plane has been hijacked, he quickly springs into action, using a payphone to alert the authorities. However, his efforts are interrupted when one of Ronay's henchmen discovers him. A brief but intense confrontation ensues, with Cutter overpowering the henchman and using him as a human shield. Cutter confronts Ronay, demanding the release of Marty, but Ronay remains eerily calm and in control. He refuses to back down, and when Cutter tries to negotiate, Ronay kills the hostage to assert his authority. Cutter and Marty manage to escape into the plane's elevator, descending to a lower level of the aircraft. There, Cutter confronts another suspicious passenger, leading to a brutal and visceral fight. The henchman pulls a knife, but Cutter's combat skills and quick thinking allow him to prevail. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies are alerted to the hijacking and begin tracking the plane's route. After overpowering one of Ronay's henchmen and securing a temporary safe zone within the plane, Cutter devises a risky plan to force the aircraft to land by emptying its fuel. He ties up the henchman and explains his strategy to Marty. Cutter's plan is drastic but necessary. He believes that Ronay is too dangerous to be allowed to maintain control of the plane, and that crashing the aircraft might be the only way to stop him. Marty, however, is horrified at the thought of intentionally bringing down the plane, fearing for the lives of the passengers. After a tense exchange, Marty reluctantly agrees, realizing that Cutter's assessment of Ronnie's ruthlessness is likely correct. Cutter proceeds to empty the fuel, causing the plane to begin its descent. The sudden loss of altitude alarms both Ronnie and the passengers, who are unaware of Cutter's actions. Ronnie, ever the calculating leader, demands answers from the pilots, who inform him that the plane is losing fuel. As the plane descends, Cutter and Marty prepare for the possibility of having to jump from the aircraft if the situation worsens. During this tense moment, Marty asks Cutter about Lisa, the name he had called her earlier. Cutter, initially reluctant to open up, reveals that Lisa was his wife, who was tragically killed during a convenience store robbery. This brief moment of vulnerability humanizes Cutter and underscores the personal stakes he carries into this life or death situation. Meanwhile, Ronnie contacts Cutter via the plane's telephone system, acknowledging Cutter's clever move to empty the fuel. Ronnie's tone is chillingly calm, almost admiring, as he congratulates Cutter on outmaneuvering him. However, he also warns Cutter not to underestimate him, setting the stage for their ongoing battle of wits. Cutter, defiant and determined, promises to bring Ronnie down, even if it means sacrificing himself and the plane. The pilots, desperate to land the plane safely, contact an airbase for permission to make an emergency landing. However, the airbase warns that the plane is too large for their facilities and that landing there would be extremely dangerous. Despite these warnings, Ronnie insists on proceeding, and the airbase reluctantly agrees, alerting local law enforcement to the situation. The plane eventually lands at the airbase, but the tension remains high as Cutter and Marty prepare to make their escape. As Cutter opens the door to jump from the plane, one of Ronnie's henchmen ambushes him, kicking him off the aircraft. Cutter narrowly avoids being crushed by the plane's wheels. Elsewhere, the situation grows increasingly chaotic. Del Vecchio, Cutter's friend and the man who hired him for the security job, is informed that Ronnie is the hijacker. Del Vecchio is confronted by Ramsey, a higher-up at the airline, who scolds him for allowing the FBI to transport a high-profile terrorist on one of their planes. Del Vecchio defends himself, explaining that the FBI does not coordinate with the airline and simply uses available flights for their operations. Meanwhile, Ronnie, now back in control of the plane, vents his frustration by slapping Marty and blaming her for interfering with his plans. Outside the plane, local law enforcement arrives, and Cutter attempts to explain his role as an airline security expert. However, the officers are skeptical and handcuff him, placing him in the back of a police car. Ronnie communicates with the local sheriff, demanding that the plane be refueled and threatening to kill passengers if his demands are not met. To demonstrate his seriousness, he throws the body of one of the pilots out of the plane, shocking the authorities into compliance. A fuel truck is summoned, and the process of refueling begins. Cutter, still in custody, advises the chief not to trust Ronnie, warning that the terrorist cannot be reasoned with. However, the chief is convinced that negotiating with Ronnie is the only way to save the hostages, and he dismisses Cutter's concerns. Later, the chief receives a call from Ronnie claiming that one of his men has betrayed him. He becomes suspicious of Cutter and orders him to be taken to the local jail. Cutter, realizing that time is running out, takes matters into his own hands. He overpowers the officers holding him, steals a police motorcycle, and sets off to confront Ronnie directly. Cutter tracks Ronnie to a nearby carnival, where a thrilling and visually dynamic chase ensues. Ronnie and his henchmen split up, forcing Cutter to navigate the chaotic environment of the carnival while evading their attacks. A close encounter on a carnival ride where Cutter narrowly avoids being shot by one of Ronnie's men. But Cutter manages to overpower the henchman, sending him to his death. Ronnie, now alone, continues to pursue Cutter, leading to a climactic fight on the carnival grounds. The two men grapple for control of a gun. Just as it seems Ronnie might gain the upper hand, local law enforcement arrives and arrests him. However, the victory is short-lived, as Ronnie warns that his associates will kill the remaining hostages if he is not released within 20 minutes. Back at the airbase, the authorities reluctantly agree to release Ronnie in exchange for the hostages' safety. As Ronnie is escorted back to the plane, a sniper takes out the officers guarding him, allowing Ronnie to regain control of the situation. Cutter, realizing that Ronnie cannot be allowed to escape, leaps onto the plane's tires as it begins to take off. As Cutter makes his way through the lower decks of the plane, he finds an access hatch leading to the plane's engine compartments. As he inches forward, he spots one of Ronnie's henchmen standing near a maintenance panel, scanning the area for any signs of trouble. Cutter crouches low, using the shadows to his advantage. A brutal fight erupts in the narrow space. The henchman throws a punch, but Cutter dodges and counters with a sharp elbow to the ribs. The man stumbles but quickly recovers, swinging wildly with a wrench. Cutter ducks and lands a powerful uppercut, sending the henchman crashing into the side of the engine housing. Breathing heavily, Cutter doesn't waste time. He makes his way to the cockpit, carefully opening the door and stepping inside. The pilots, still on edge, tense up at the sight of him, but Cutter quickly raises his hands in a non-threatening manner. He tells them he is one of the good guys and that he is here to stop Ronnie. The pilots exchange glances before nodding, realizing that Cutter might be their only hope. Cutter sneaks back toward the main cabin. He spots Ronnie standing near the aisle. Without hesitation, Cutter lunges at Ronnie, catching him off guard. The two men begin struggling for control of the gun. Ronnie, despite his refined and calculated demeanor, is a skilled fighter, matching Cutter blow for blow. In the chaos, Ronnie accidentally fires a shot that shatters one of the plane's windows. Instantly, the cabin is filled with the deafening roar of rushing air. Oxygen masks drop from the ceiling as passengers struggle to breathe. The pressure inside the cabin destabilizes, and loose objects begin flying through the air. Cutter and Ronnie continue their brutal fight, their bodies being pulled by the force of the decompression. Cutter and Ronnie continue their desperate struggle near the open doorway. With one final, powerful kick, Cutter sends Ronnie flying backward. The terrorist's eyes widen in shock as he loses his grip and is sucked out of the plane. The threat is finally over. Cutter stumbles back to the cockpit and grabs the radio, calling the airbase to deliver the good news. The officers on the ground erupt in celebration as they hear that Ronnie is dead and the passengers are safe. As the plane makes its descent, the tension begins to ease. The passengers, though shaken, realize they have survived the ordeal. The plane touches down smoothly at the airbase, where police officers, medics, and news reporters are already waiting. The passengers are escorted off the plane, many of them crying tears of relief. Cutter and Marty step off the aircraft, and walk off together, ready to start a new chapter, leaving behind the nightmare that was Flight 163.